Hello, welcome back. Today is The Wall, Part 3 by Marlen Haushofer. Finally, I went back to the hunting lodge and made a fire. I later saw that Lynx had gone to the George and stood there motionless, waiting. After a while, he turned around and trotted back to the house, headed lowered. He did this the following 3 or 4 evenings. Then he suddenly seemed to give up. I don't know if he just forget or if, in his dog's way, he realized the truth before I did. I gave him risotto and dog biscuits and filled his bowl with water. I knew that he was usually fed only in the morning, but I didn't want to eat on my own. Then I brewed myself some tea and sat down at the big table again. It was now warm in the hunting lodge, and the oil lamp cast its yellow glow over the dark wood. It was only now that I realized how tired I was. Lynx, who had finished eating, jumped up and joined me on the bench and watched me long and attentively. His eyes were reddish brown and warm, a little darker than his coat. The white around the iris gleamed damp and bluish. Suddenly I was very glad that Louise had sent the dog home. I put the empty teacups away, poured warm water into the tin bowl, and washed myself. And then, since there was nothing else to do, I went to bed. I had closed the windows and bolted the door. After a little while, Lynx jumped down off the bench, came over to me, and sniffed at my hand. Then he walked over to the door, from there to the window, and back to my bed. I talked to him for a good while, and at last, after a sigh that sounded almost human, he sought out his sleeping place in the stove door. I let the torch burn for a while, and when I finally turned it off, the room seemed as dark as it could be. But it wasn't all that dark. The remains of the fire in the stove cast a weak, flickering glow on the floor, and after a while I could make out the outlines of the bench and the table. I wondered whether I should take one of the Hugo's sleeping tablets, but I couldn't bring myself to do it, afraid that I might miss hearing something. Then it occurred to me that the terrible wall might slowly move closer in the silence and darkness of night. But I was much too tired to be afraid. My feet still hurt, and I was lying stretched out on my back, too tired to turn my head. After everything that had happened, I had to be prepared myself for a bad night. But once I had come to terms with this thought, I went straight to sleep. I didn't dream and woke up refreshed around 6 o'clock when the birds started singing. I immediately remember everything and closed my eyes in terror, trying to sink back to sleep. I couldn't, of course. Although I had barely moved, Lynx knew I was awake and came to my bed to greet me with a happy wag of his tail. So I got up, opened the windows, and let Lynx into the open. It was very cool. The sky was still pale blue, and the bushes wet with dew. A bright day was dawning. Suddenly, it seemed quite impossible that I would survive that bright May day. At the same time, I knew I had to survive it, and that I had no means of escape. I had to stay quite calm and simply get through it. It wasn't the first day of my life that I had had to survive like this. The less I resisted it, the more bearable it would be. The dazed state of the previous day had entirely vanished from my head. I was able to think clearly, as clearly as ever had. But when my thoughts approached the wall, it was as if they too bumped up against a cool, smooth, and quite insuperable barrier. It was better not to think about the wall. I slipped into my dressing gown and slippers, walked along the wet path of the car, and switched the radio on. A gentle, empty hum. It sounded so strange and inhuman that I switched it off straight away. I no longer believed that there was something broken in it. In the cool light of morning, it was quite impossible for me to believe that. I no longer remember what I did that morning. I only remember standing motionless beside the car for a while, until I was startled by the damp seeping through my slippers. Perhaps the hours that followed were so terrible that I have had to forget them, but perhaps I only spent them in a state of numbness. I can't remember. I only know that I came to again around 2 in the afternoon when I walked through the George with links. For the first time, I didn't find the George charmingly romantic, but merely damp and gloomy. It's like that even at the height of summer, the sunlight never touches the ground there. After thunderstorms, the fire salamanders creep out of their stone layers. Later in summer, I was sometimes able to watch them. There were so many. I often saw 10 or 15 in a single afternoon. Glorious creatures, molded black and red, more like satin flowers, tiger lilies or tox caps. Then their relations, the plain grayish-green lizards. I have never touched a salamander, while I am happy to touch lizards. That day, on the 2nd of May, I didn't see them. It hadn't rained, and I still had no idea that they were there. I could go out quickly to escape the damp green gloom. This time I was better equipped with mountain boots, knee-length socks, and a warm cap. The coat had been a nuisance the day before. It had dragged along the meadow while I was marking out the boundary. I had taken Hugo's binoculars with me as well, and in my resket I had a thermal flask of coca and sandwiches. Apart from these, as well as my little pen knife for sharpening pencils, I had taken along Hugo's sharp jackknife. I couldn't use it because it was too dangerous to get down branches with. I would only have get my hand. Although I was reluctant to admit it to myself, I carried the knife for self-protection. It was something that gave me a deceptive sense of security. Later on, I often left it at home. Since Lynx died, I have carried it with me whenever I go. At least I now know precisely why, and no longer convince myself that I needed to cut down hazel branches. The wall was, of course, still where I had marked it, and hadn't shifted nearer to the hunting lodge as I had imagined in the evening. It hadn't moved back, either, but wouldn't have expected that. The stream had returned to its usual mirror surface, so it had clearly found it easy to penetrate the loose rock. I was able to cross it, jumping from stone to stone, and then followed by my twine boundary to the vantage point behind the larches. There I broke off fresh branches and began marking out the wall again. It was an arduous task, and my back soon ached from all the bending, but I was almost obsessed with the idea that I had to go the decks finished as best I could. It comforted me and brought a bit of order into the huge, terrible disorder that had invaded my life. Something like the world simply could not exist. In marking it out with green sticks, I was making my first attempt, since it was there, to assign to it an appropriate place. My path led over to mountain pastures, through a young growth of spruces, and over an overgrown patch of wild raspberries. The sun was burning, and my hands were bleeding, torn by thorns and splinters. Of course, I could only use the little sticks in the pasture, while the thick cats I needed real posts. Here and there, I marked the trees near the wall with my pocket knife. All this held me up, and I made very slow progress. From the top of the raspberry patch, I could see almost the whole valley below me. Using the binoculars, I could see everything very clearly and sharply. In front of the coachmaker's cottage, a woman sat motionless in the sand. I couldn't see her face. Her head was lowered, and she seemed to be asleep. I watched for such a long time. The tears came to my eyes, and the image dissolved into shapes and colors. A sheepdog lay and moving across the doorstep, its head on its paws. If this was that, it had come swiftly and softly, almost lovingly. Perhaps it would have been more sensible to have gone to the village with Hugo and Louise. Finally, I tore myself away from the peaceful scene and went on planting my branches. The world now dipped into a meadow, with a one-story farmhouse in it, only a little small holding, such as one often finds in the mountains, not like the big square farms in the open countryside. The wall divided the little meadow behind the house, and had cut two branches off an apple tree. They didn't look as if they'd been cut off incidentally, but rather as if they'd been melted, if you could imagine melted wood. I didn't touch them. Two cows lay on the other side of the wall in the meadow. I looked at them for a long time. Their flanks were rising and falling. They too looked more asleep than dead. Their pink nostrils were no longer damp and smooth, and looked instead like prettily painted fine grained stone. Lynx turned his head and looked away into the forest. He didn't break into that terrible howling, but simply didn't look, as if he had decided not to take in anything on the other side of the world. My parents had once had a dog that turned from mirrors in a similar way. While I was still watching the two dead animals, I suddenly heard a cow moving behind me, and Lynx, barking excitedly. The nose whipped me round, and then the undergrowth parted, and out of it, followed by the excited dog, stepped a living, moving cow. She walked straight up to me and bellowed out all her pain to me. The poor creature hadn't been milked for 2 days. Her voice sounded quite hoarse and raw. I immediately tried to relieve her. As a young girl, I had learned how to milk for Fan, but that had been 20 years ago, and I was completely out of practice. The cow patiently complied, having understood that I wanted to help her. The yellow milk spotted onto the earth, and Link set about licking it up. The cow gave a great deal of milk, and the unfamiliar grip made my hands ache. All of a sudden, the cow was quite content, and leaned down and brought her big mouth close to Link's brown nose. This mutual assessment seemed to be favorable, for both animals were content and calm. So there I was in a wild and strange meadow in the middle of the forest, and suddenly I was the owner of a cow. It was quite plain that I couldn't leave the cow behind. It was only now that I noticed blood stains on her mouth. She had obviously been desperately running against the wall, which was stopping her getting home to her Byre and her people. There was no sign of those people. They must have stayed in the house when the catastrophe happened. The drawn curtains over the little windows convinced me yet again that all of this had happened in the evening. Not too late, because the old man had just washed himself, and that old woman with a cat had still been sitting on the bench in front of the house. In the early morning, one is still cool, and the old woman doesn't sit on the bench by her house with her cat. Also, if the disaster had occurred in the morning, Hugo and Louise would have been home ages before. I consider all of this immediately told myself that considerations such as these were absolutely no use. So I abandoned them and searched through the corpse, calling encouragingly for another cow, but nothing stirred. If there had been a bull somewhere in the vicinity, Lynx would have flushed it out a long time ago. I had no alternative but to drive the cow back home, over hill and dale. The boundary I had marked out certainly served a useful purpose, for in the meantime it had grown later. It was about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and the only narrow shafts of sunlight fell on the glade. So the three of us walked home. It was a good thing that I had planted the branches and I didn't have to slow myself down by feeling my way along the wall. I walked slowly between the wall and the cow, continually anxious that the animal might break a leg, but that seemed used to walking in a mountain's landscape. I didn't have to drive her on ahead of me, but simply make sure that she stayed at a safe distance from the wall. Lynx had already grasped the meaning of my twine boundary and kept at a safe distance. All the way home, I didn't give the wall so much as a thought. I was so preoccupied with my foundling. Sometimes the cow would certainly stop and start grazing, and then Lynx would lie down nearby and keep a constant eye on her. If she went on far too long, he, he pushed her gently and she obediently started moving again. I don't know how right I was, but during the time that followed, I sometimes had the impression that Lynx had a very good notion of how cows were to be treated. I think the huntsman must sometimes have used him as a watchdog when he drove his cows to the meadow in the autumn. The cow seemed completely calm and happy. After 2 terrible days, she had found a human being, had been freed from her painful burden of milk, and hadn't a thought of running away. Somewhere there had to be a buyer that this new human would have taken her to. Snuffling hopefully, she trotted along by my side. When with some difficulty we had crossed the stream, she even speeded up, and in the end it was all I could do to keep up with her. In the meantime, I had realized that this cow, while certainly a blessing, was also a great burden. There could no longer be any question of long reconnaissance missions. An animal like this wants to be fed and milked and needs a settled master. I was the owner and the prisoner of a cow, but even if I hadn't wanted the cow, I couldn't have left her behind. She was dependent on me. When we reached the clearing and it was almost dark, the cow stopped, looked backwards, and moved quietly and happily. I led her to the huntsman's hut. There was nothing inside but 2 bunk beds, a table, a bench, and an oven in the wall. I carried the table into the open, tore the straw sack from one of the beds, and led the cow into her new byre. There was plenty of room for a cow. I took a tin pot off the stove, filled it with water, and placed it in the empty bed. It was all I could do for my cow that evening. I stroked her, explained the new situation to her, and then bolted the door. I was so tired that I could barely get myself back to the hunting lodge. My feet burned in my heavy shoes, and the small of my back ached. my fat links and drunk coca from the thermos flags. I was too hungry to eat the sandwiches. That evening I washed with cold water at the spring and then went straight to bed. Lynx also seemed to be tired, for immediately after he had eaten the crab, he crept into his stove door. The following morning wasn't as unbearable as the previous morning had been, because the minute I opened my eyes, I thought about the cow. I was immediately wide awake, but still very fatigued by my new efforts. I had also slept rather late, and the sunlight fell into yellow streaks through the slats of the shutters. I got up and set to work. There were a lot of pots and pans in the hunting lodge, and I chose a bucket as a milking pail and took it into the byre. The cow was standing quietly by the bed and greeted me by happily licking my face. I milked her. It was harder than the day before because every bone in my body ached. Milking is an extremely strenuous job, and I would have to get used to it again. But I knew the right grip to use, which was the most important thing as far as I was concerned. Since I had no hay, after I had milked the cow, I drove her to the forest meadow and let her graze there. I knew, without a doubt, that she couldn't run away from me. Then, at last, I had my breakfast, warm milk, and the stale sandwich from the day before. The whole day, I remember quite clearly, was dedicated to the cow. I arranged the byre as best I could. I spread out green branches for her, since I had no straw, and with her first dung, I laid the foundations of a dung heap beside the hut. The byre was solidly built from the tough timbers. Under the roof, in the corner, was a little room, and I later staffed with straw. But back in May, there wasn't any straw as yet, and until autumn, I had to make do with fresh branches. I thought about the cow as well, of course. If I was especially lucky, she would be expecting a calf, but I couldn't rely on that. I could only hope that my cow would give milk for as long as possible. I still saw my situation as a transitory condition. At least that's what I tried to do. I had little notion about cattle rearing. I had once witnessed the birth of a calf, but I didn't even know the length of a cow's gestation. I have learned that in the meantime from a farmer's diary, but I don't know much more than that to this day, and have no idea how I could find out anything more about it. I wanted to take out a little oven in the byre, but later found it to be quite practical. If necessary, I could heat up water there. I carried the table and a chair into the garage when where there were a lot of tools. Hugo had always made sure that he had good tools, and the huntsman, an honest, tidy man, had made sure that they were always in working order. I don't know why Hugo set such great store by the tools. He never touched them himself, but looked at them with great satisfaction every time he visited the place. If it was a fad of his, then that fad was a blessing. It is thanks to Hugo's mild eccentricities that I am still alive today. Dear old Hugo, God bless him. I'm sure he is still sitting at the table in the inn with a glass of lemonade in front of him, finally and afraid of illness and death, and there is no longer anyone to send him to those business conferences. While I was busy with the Byra, the cow stood grazing at the forest meadow. She was a pretty animal, fine-boned, rounded, and grayish-brown. She somehow looked cheerful and young. The way she turned her head in all directions, coquettish young woman looking over her shoulder with moist brown eyes. I immediately took the cow to my heart. It made me so happy to look at her. Lynx ran about close by me, kept his eyes on the ground, on the cow, drank from the trout at the spring, and went off on little hunting expeditions in the bushes. He was his old self again, the old cheerful dog, and seemed to have forgotten his fears of the last few days. He seemed to have got used to the idea that at least temporarily I was his master. At midday I made soup with Ups roost and opened a tin of corned beef. After the meal, I was overwhelmed with fatigue. I told Lynx to keep an eye on the cow for a while, and lay down on the bed with my clothes on, as if under anesthetic. After everything that had happened, I ought not to have been able to sleep at all, but I must say that for the first few days in the hunting lodge I slept particularly well, until my body had got used to the heavy walk. Insomnia only began to bother me much later on. At about 4 o'clock I woke up. The cow had lain down, chewing the cud. Link sat on the bench by the house and watched her sleepily. I relieved him of his guard duties, and he went off exploring again. At the time, I always grew worried the minute I couldn't see him. Later, when I knew how much I could rely on him, I completely lost this fear. When it grew cool, I put water on the stove to heat. I desperately needed a bath. Towards evening, I took the cow into the byre, milked her, poured fresh water into the pot on the basket, and then left her alone for the night. After my bath, I wrapped myself in my dressing gown, drank hot milk, and then sat down at the table to have a think. I was amazed that I didn't feel sad and desperate. I grew so sleepy that I had to rest my head on my hands and almost fell asleep in my chair. But since I couldn't think after all, I tried to read one of the Hugo's thrillers. But it didn't seem to be the right thing. I wasn't very interested in the white slave trade at the particular moment. Incidentally, Hugo too hard regularly dozed off on the third or fourth page of his hard-boiled thrillers. Maybe he used them as a kind of sleeping portion. Likewise, I managed only 10 minutes at the most, then resolutely got up, switched off the torch, bolted the door, and went to bed. The next morning the weather was cool and cheerless, and made me realize that I had to go get hold of some hay for my cow. I remembered having seen a barn in the meadow by the stream. Perhaps there was still a little hay in it. I had no way of using Hugo's car. He had taken the key with him when he went away. Only 2 weeks ago, urged by my daughters, I had completed a course of driving lessons, and wouldn't have risked driving to the church for any price. I found a few old snacks in the garage, and sacks in the garage, and after walking in the stable, I set off, laden with these, in search of hay. In the brain, in the barn, in the meadow, by the stream, I actually did find some hay. I stuffed it into the sacks, which I tied together and dragged behind me. But I soon saw that the snacks weren't going to withstand the journey along the gravel path. So I left two of them lying at the side of the road and carried the other two over my shoulders to the hunting lodge. I cleared the tools out of the garage and lodged them into the room beside the kitchen, then fetched the snacks I had left behind and emptied them into the garage. I want to fetch mine twice. I want to fetch hay twice more in the afternoon, and then again the following day. It was now early May, and around this time it can still get chillingly cold in the mountains. As long as it stayed cool and slightly rainy, I was able to graze the cow on the forest meadow. She seemed very happy with her new life and patiently put up with mine. clumsy milking. Sometimes she turned her great head towards me, as if she was watching my efforts with amusement. But she stood there quietly and never kicked at me. She was friendly, often even a little bumptious. Thank you so much.